Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing coverage of the late medieval, early modern period of church history. Moving into the reign of Pope 196, John the 22nd. Pope 195, Pope Clement V, died on April 20th, 1314. The conclave first met at Carpentras, and ethnic hatreds immediately emerged. There were 8 Italians, 10 Gascons, and 3 Provençals, and 3 others from different parts of France. The Italians wanted a man who would return the papacy back to Rome. The French were not united, because Gascony, even though now it's in the nation of France, but technically then it was under English rule, while Provence favored de facto independence from both England and France. They wanted it their own country. Demonic influence successfully manipulated these ambitions into a division that caused the conclave to disband without electing a pope, leaving the Holy See sede vacante, meaning no pope, for 2 years, 3 months, and 18 days. It was not until June 26, 1316, that the French heir apparent, the future king, Philippe V, hosted a conclave at Lyon, France, at which all but one of the cardinals attended, 23 out of 24. During that 2-year period when there was no pope, 2 events of long-term importance that would affect church history occurred. Event number 1. In October of 1314, there was a disputed election for the position of Holy Roman Emperor. Recall that Germany was not a united nation at the time, was not a single nation at the time, but instead consisted of over 340 sovereignties, ranging in size from kingdoms to duchies to margravites to counties to baronies and even some free cities. The position of Holy Roman Emperor was at the time elective, like the papacy, with the number of electors varying at this period. They would not be set at 7 until the year 1356. Ideally, the Pope would confirm and crown the man elected by the majority of the electors. But in 1314, there was no Pope because of the sede vacante that we just mentioned. 2 men claimed to have a majority of the votes and therefore the right to be the next Holy Roman Emperor, which they had. Each of them had 4 out of the 7 electoral votes, because 4 of the electors changed their votes more than once in exchange for gold, for bribe money. One of the men claiming to be Holy Roman Emperor was Bavarian, that's southern Germany, from House Wittelsbach, and he was claiming to be Emperor Ludwig IV, or Louis IV. The other was an Austrian of the House Habsburg, Frederick, called Frederick the Fair. Second event during the sede vacante, on May 31st, 1316, the Franciscans elected as their Master General an Italian named Michael of Cesena, Cesena, lived from 1230 to 1342. The election was routine. That's how they chose their generals. However, this election led to an escalation in the poverty dispute, which we covered in a previous video, as Michael favored the extreme interpretation of the matter of poverty, the interpretation that Christ and the apostles practiced both individual and communal poverty, and therefore the church should as well, that the church should not own anything, either individual members or the church as an institution or its constituent elements like dioceses, religious orders, parishes. It took the cardinals at the second conclave, the 1316 conclave, meeting at Lyon, 2 months to agree to a compromise candidate among their number. They chose Jacques Duise. That's D''Euse, serving at the time as Cardinal Bishop of Porto. He was born in southern France in 1244 within the Archdiocese of Toulouse, but he had studied in northern France, studied law at Paris. He had worked as chancellor for 2 successive kings of Naples, which is southern Italy, but remember it's ruled by a French dynasty, the House d'Anjou. He declared in conclave that he was open to returning the Holy See to Rome if conditions proved favorable. He was known to live a life of personal simplicity and to have earned a reputation as a diligent and moderate churchman. He reigned as Pope 196, taking the papal name John the 22nd, for 18 years and 4 months. At the time of his coronation, northern Italy, at the time he accepted election, and it took place in Lyon, which is in France. At the time, northern Italy was bleeding in a war between Milan and Venice. Had nothing to do with the church, but it was north of the Papal States, so obviously travel, it would interdict travel or make travel unsafe. So the ceremony, he was already a bishop, so he had the fullness of orders, but he had to be crowned as pope. That ceremony took place in Lyon on September 5th, 1316. And because of the Milanese-Venetian War, no moves were made to return the Holy See to Rome, so he is the next of the Avignon popes. As Pope John the 22nd, he first had to declare himself on the contested election for Holy Roman Emperor. He chose to support the Habsburg candidate, Frederick of Austria, because he felt that Ludwig, the German Wittelsbach candidate, the Bavarian, was too aggressive for the well-being of the church. That made Ludwig of Bavaria his blood enemy. For the first 6 years of Pope John's pontificate, Ludwig and Frederick fought to assert their claim. John the 22nd attempted to do his best for the church in terms of internal governance, given the limitations of his position. On November 19, 1317, he attempted to curb a baneful practice that had crept into the church owing to the feudalism problem. Specifically, he forbade the holding of more than 2 benefices at the same time, believing that it was not possible for one man to responsibly discharge his obligations to more than 2 assignments, cura animorum, with care of souls. So like 2 parishes for a parish priest. So he said no more than 2. You can't have 3 or 4. Naturally, he was widely ignored because at this point the dynastic fangs of feudalism were sucking too deeply of the church's blood. And remember, each of those assignments, like parishes or dioceses, whatever, they would have fiefs attached to them, which means income. So that's why accretion of these benefices was done. With regard to external considerations, the political chaos in Italy deprived him of much of his revenue from the Papal States. To compensate, he issued a command in 1317 that was to bring much harm to the church. He invented a new tax. It's called annates. So seminarians think of the root. What is the Latin word for year? Anno. So annates, annates. Annates refers to the first year's income from a benefice, like the first fruits of the harvest. He demanded that all benefices of a diocesan level or higher, or monastic level or higher, that 1 year's income, the annates, 1 year's income be paid to the Holy See as a tax. Now, that could be amortized over 5 years, but they still had to pay 1 year's income as a tax. Now, this transparent, naked, money grab alienated many, even loyal Catholics, particularly the English and Germans, who resented having to pay such sums to a Frenchman living in France. And it should be noted, in the long term, both England and Germany left the church during the early Protestant movement, and arguments against financial exactions by the church figured prominently in arguments that led to leaving in both countries. This is one of many factors that must be considered when coming to terms with how many people in so many places were willing to abandon the church when the Protestant movement began. Practices such as annates could be and were manipulated into emotional support for ecclesial nationalism, which was an essential element in the success of the Protestant movement. The practice of annates must also be taken into consideration in understanding the next phase of the ongoing rift within the Franciscans over individual and communal poverty. In 1317, the same year that he invented the tax of annates, and thereby tainting his credibility in the eyes of many, John the 22nd condemned a position defended by some Fraticelli, the spiritual Franciscans. The Fraticelli believed that storing provisions represented a lack of faith in divine providence, that they should beg every day, literally. But he condemned that. And there's the biblical, and nothing else, in the book of Genesis, Joseph, son of Jacob, he had the dream. Well, he interpreted the dream, Pharaoh's dream, as being in the 7 years of plenty, you store up food, because you don't assume that every year is going to be a year of plenty, because that just doesn't happen. So that when the years of famine come, you're prepared. So this position, that storing provisions represents a lack of faith, that's contradicted by the Bible. On May 30th, 1322, the Franciscans held a general chapter at Perugia under Michael of Cesena, who had been elected to that position when the Holy See was sede vacante, when there was no pope. They met to formulate a response to John's condemnation. They voted to adopt a position as an order, that Jesus and the apostles owned nothing of their own. This came to be known as the Perugia Declaration. 4 months later, before the Pope could respond, the disputed imperial succession was resolved on the battlefield when Ludwig of Bavaria defeated and captured Frederick von Habsburg at the Battle of Mühldorf on September 28, 1322. Ludwig then demanded coronation, as demanded of the Pope, that the Pope crown him as Holy Roman Emperor, saying, "I want it by right of conquest." Pope John the 22nd refused, arguing that the matter of the imperial succession was a legal dispute that should be resolved as such and should not be resolved by force of arms. Ludwig then began encouraging Italian proto-nationalists in northern Italy, particularly Milan, against the Pope, who was not only ethnically French, but was actually living in France. So the ethnic hatred. The following year, November 12, 1323, Pope John the 22nd condemned the Perugia Declaration as heretical, because the New Testament depicted the apostles as owning boats and houses, and the group as holding money even after they, left their homes and followed Jesus. They still, as a group, because Judas he stole from their money bag, so they had a money bag. This condemnation of the Perugia Declaration alienated many of the Franciscans, who felt that the Pope was prejudiced by financial interest and therefore unable to be theologically objective. The next year, 1324, with the Pope asserting his right to arbitrate the imperial succession, but refusing to recognize Ludwig as the legitimate emperor, Ludwig then borrowed a strategy from the late French king Philippe IV, who had used against Boniface VIII. He turned to publicity. You remember publicity. The definition is organized lies for the purpose of manipulation. Ludwig employed the services of an Italian anti-clerical person. He was actually a physician by training, but became a theologian by interest, named Marsilius of Padua. Lived from 1275 to 1342. He was trained at the University of Paris. Marsilius, in his theological work, he plagiarized from two previous works, extracted some arguments from those works, used those as the foundation to create his own heresy. First, he plagiarized the works of John of Paris, who in his 1302 treatise De Potestate, on power, argued that the Pope was head of the Church only by delegation through his election by the cardinals as representatives of the faithful. Therefore, ultimate authority in the Church resided with the members of the body of the faithful, which they could exercise at a church council, through a church council, up to and including removing a pope. Second, Marsilius borrowed an argument put forward by the embittered poet Dante Alighieri, who lived from, in his 1312 treatise De Monarchia, on monarchy, that there were two forms of happiness, eternal and earthly. God intended that the emperor govern pursuit of earthly happiness, while the Pope guide pursuit of eternal happiness, with both being equally subordinate to God, but in separate spheres. So building on those two works, in 1324, Marsilius of Padua published, with Ludwig's support, a treatise titled Defensor Pacis, Peace's Defender. He argued that ultimate sovereignty in creation obviously resides with God. God bestowed authority on the people by endowing them with free will. Because God does not wish, he did not create anyone to be slaves. He created us to be free because he gave us free will, obviously, so he intends us to be free. In order to remain free, the people, as an aggregate, need protection, a defender of the peace, because sin exists, and some people are not going to want to keep the peace. So those who do want to live in peace, need someone to protect them. For this reason, the people, as an aggregate, entrust power to monarchs, and the highest monarch, the emperor. In return for protecting the peace, the people owe the emperor allegiance, obedience, and service. The church and state must be separate, but since the church depends on the state for protection, he argued, the church owes obedience to the state. The Pope has an honorary position owing to the ancient heritage of Rome, but, Marsilius argued, there is nothing in the nature of the position that grants him authority to impose dogmatic interpretations on the people. He can articulate them, but the people remain free, because their freedom comes from God, not from the Pope. On March 23rd, 1324, Pope John the 22nd excommunicated both Marsilius of Padua and Ludwig, who published his work for these heresies. The following year, 1325, a majority of the Franciscans submitted to Pope John the 22nd's condemnation of the Perugia Declaration. But a statistically significant minority, including the general himself, Michael of Cesena, refused to recant. They demanded a hearing to defend their position. The following year, 1326, Ludwig of Bavaria decided to force the issue with the Pope. He could not get to the Pope personally because the Pope was living in France, and Ludwig did not have the resources to invade France. But he could invade Italy because Italy was in a state of total anarchy without government at all. Well, Naples did, but that's in the south. But as far as northern Italy and the Papal States, there was no effective government. In the same year, 1326, Michael of Cesena and the other Fraticelli, Franciscans, meaning those who refused to recant, arrived in Avignon, where the Pope was living, for their trial, to defend their position. There in Avignon, they met another Franciscan, but this one English, who was also in Avignon to defend himself from charges of a different kind of theological error. So in this way, they came together. The guy they met, William of Ockham, Ockham, lived from 1285 to 1347. Ockham was born in Surrey, southwest of London, in a village called Oak Hamlet, hence Ockham. He was given to the Franciscans by his family at an early age, therefore joined the bloated ranks of clergy who had been forced into the church without a genuine vocation. And, parasited off the church, got an education from the church, including going to Oxford, studying in Oxford, England. As part of the way universities, I think we covered this in an earlier video, but the way universities were at the time, in order to get the rank of magister, to get a master's, or as we would say, a master's degree, but then it was a rank, master of theology. It was necessary for one to produce a commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard. And remember, the sentences were a collection, four books that were, it was an anthology of excerpts, sentences, literally excerpts of quotes from the fathers of the church, from the Bible, from church councils. So one had to do a commentary on those in front of the university senate, and then they would decide whether or not you merited the title of magister, to be that you have mastered theology. So in his commentary, Ockham revived and defended an erroneous metaphysics that we covered earlier in the course called nominalism. To refresh your memory, the prefix nomina, that is from the Latin word meaning name. Nominalism denied the existence of universals. Universal truth, objective truth, like goodness, truth, beauty, right and wrong. Either denied that they existed, or other nominalists would assert, well, maybe they exist, but we can't know them, so functionally it doesn't make a difference to us. So the nominalist asserted that the most we can do is assign names, hence nomina, names, nominalism, names to concepts just for the sake of convenience of talking about them, but like good, right, wrong, humanity, church, grace. We assign them names for convenience, but we cannot assert and we cannot know if they do have an independent objective existence. We cannot know if there is an objective right and wrong, true and false. This is heretical. So for this, Ockham was expelled from Oxford University by the Chancellor, John Lutterell, without obtaining his magister. And two fellow English Franciscans were horrified by this. They reported Ockham to the Holy See for heresy, because even though he was expelled from the university, Ockham was still a Franciscan. So they didn't want this guy, they wanted him to recant. So that's why. So Ockham went to Avignon to defend himself. Before Cesena and the Italian Franciscans arrived, Ockham had already had his preliminary hearing before a commission. The commission saw problems with his work, but they gave him an opportunity to revise it and then represent it. But his case, that was where it stood. His case was unresolved. He had his preliminary hearing, but no resolution. And it was in that state, in that time frame, that the Italian Franciscans arrived to defend their position of absolute poverty articulated in the condemned Perugia Declaration. In 1327, Occam joined Cesena and the Fraticelli, arguing that Christ and the apostles owned nothing, either individually or as a group. Their views were condemned, and by the Inquisition at Avignon, and they were given a chance to recant. So it's okay. We heard you. You're wrong, but you can recant rather than submit. Pride, see, this is where pride comes in. Rather than submit and admit they were wrong, the group escaped from Avignon and made their way to a place they knew they would find welcome. They went to the Pope's enemy, Ludwig of Bavaria. At the time, Ludwig was camped with his army at Pisa in Italy, fresh from his conquest of Milan, and in Pisa he had staged a coronation of himself as Rex Italicum, as King of Italy. He welcomed the heretics as allies in his anti-papal cause. So William of Ockham, Cesena, Marsilius of Padua. So Marsilius was already there with John. He was already a patron. So Ludwig was giving patronage and support and protection to all of them. Marsilius already, and now William of Ockham and Michael of Cesena. In the following year, January 1328, Ludwig successfully invaded and occupied the city of Rome, where he went through another staged coronation of himself as Holy Roman Emperor, as Sacrum Imperator Romanorum. He was crowned by a member of the Colonna family, House Colonna. On April 18, 1328, Ludwig then declared, he said, okay, I'm emperor now. He declared Pope John the 22nd deposed as pope on the grounds of heresy. On May 12th, he supported the invalid election of a Fraticelli as a rival pope, as pope. This is obviously bogus, so this is an anti-pope. Pietro Rinalducci of Corvara, or Pietro of Corvara. Obviously, this is bogus, so this is the 32nd of the so far 39 anti-popes. Now, he took a papal name, but that name was later taken by a real pope, so I don't want to confuse it. We'll just say Pietro of Corvara, Peter of Corvara. And he was crowned. This fake pope was crowned by the Archbishop of Venice, who despised the French pope, the real pope. This anti-pope, Pietro, then ordained Marsilius of Padua, who was a layman at the time, but ordained him as Archbishop of Milan. In that position, Marsilius spent his time persecuting clergy in Milan and Lombardy and northern Italy who remained loyal to the true pope. On June 6, 1328, the real pope, John the 22nd, excommunicated this anti-pope, Pietro of Corvara, and excommunicated William of Ockham and Michael of Cesena, who technically was still Franciscan Master General at the time he was excommunicated. Then, to retaliate, following the political theology of John of Paris, Marsilius of Padua, Michael condemned Pope John as a heretic and appealed for justice to a church council, declaring that a church council, as the representative of the sensus fidelium of the aggregate of the people, who have freedom given to them by God, not by the church, that a church council had the authority to judge the pope and to depose a pope, and he was asserting, Michael was asserting, that there was grounds, and that the pope should be put on trial by a council, and that he could prove the grounds, and then the council should remove the pope. So this is the heresy of conciliarism. The next year, February 19, 1329, the Heresy Club, as we can call them now, so this is Marsilius and William of Ockham and Michael of Cesena, supported by Ludwig, so the Heresy Club, assembled at Pisa. There, a straw scarecrow was dressed up in full pontifical robes. It was escorted into the Cathedral of Pisa, and it had a sign put around it. It was with the name Jacques Duise, which is the Pope John's real name, John the 22nd. The straw scarecrow, literally the straw man, was informed of the charges that he was accused of heresy. Given the opportunity to respond, he remained silent. The charges. So then the trial proceeded, and it was condemned. The straw figure was condemned and offered the opportunity to recant the heresy. He still remained silent, which means he refused to recant the heresy. So then he was handed over. So the figure was handed over to the secular authorities, meaning Ludwig, to be executed. Since the charge was heresy, the method of execution was burning at the stake. John, the real Pope John, struck back by summoning his French allies, which included, remember, the rulers of Naples in southern Italy, because there was the House d'Anjou. Naples at the time was ruled by King Robert, or Robert, since he was French, Robert II. He assembled his army and he marched north. He engaged Ludwig, defeated him in battle, and chased him out of Italy. Ludwig retreated. Once again, it was good to get Ludwig out of Rome, but here we have what does the outside see? All they see is that a French pope using essentially French mercenaries to impose his will in Italy. So the ethnic hatred, The anti-pope, Pietro of Cavara, was abandoned. He was captured and brought before the true pope. In exchange for a full and public recanting and submission, which he did on June 25th, 1330, Pope John pardoned him and allowed him to live the rest of his life in Avignon, and he lived for another 3 years, died in 1333. So the long-term importance of this episode is both ridiculous as well as sordid. So the long-term importance can be summarized as follows. First, the political theology it generated brought into public discourse the concept of popular sovereignty as being of divine institution. That God created each human being to be free, and therefore both individually and as a group. That humanity as a group was given freedom by God, not by the king, not by the church. So these works articulating that would be used later in a way that but it would be used as source material in the development of democracy as a modern political ideology based on the social contract idea of the people and government. So remember, nothing just happens. Nothing just happens. So John Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, Jefferson, those people didn't just happen. The centuries of development and writings, that went into that idea. Second, a public challenge had been made against the claims of spiritual jurisdiction by the Pope, as well as to the Pope's right to involve himself in the affairs of the Holy Roman Empire. And remember from earlier in the medieval course, the Holy Roman Empire was created by papal action when Leo III crowned the first one, Charlemagne, on Christmas Day in 800. This idea of separation of church and state, with the state being superior in authority to the church, because the church needs the state for protection, from this point on, became a fixed idea in public discourse. And it was not universally accepted yet, but it was put out there, and it never went away. Third, the political theology of popular sovereignty would be applied to the development of the ecclesiology of conciliarism, the assertion that the body of the faithful, through their representatives at a church council, have the authority to judge and remove a pope. Fourth, both the written discourse generated during this episode as well as the resentment over the financial policy of the tax theft of annates, would be used to devastating effect by later anti-papal writers and Protestant publicists to characterize the papacy as a worldly entity with interest of an exclusively political and economic nature. Fifth, on the whole, the episode is a vivid example of demonic influence exploiting greed, pride, and ethnic hatred to sow division within the body of Christ. Now, much of what happened was beyond Pope John's control, but he was not completely innocent. Even though the annates, making up the annates, that might have been a financial necessity, but it had long-term consequences, so he was not completely guiltless in this. Neither the poverty dispute nor the contested imperial succession would have unfolded differently had the Holy See resided in Rome. Yet, there is no doubt that the Holy See residing in Avignon, France, provided a powerful weapon in terms of publicity to wield against the Pope and manipulating the emotions of the public and turning them against the papacy. So this is a Frenchman living in France. Those are his interests. He has abdicated. The line of reasoning would be that he's essentially abdicated his objectivity that is needed to govern the universal church. That now, as a Frenchman living in France, those are his interests. John the 22nd died on December 4th, 1334, after a reign of 18 years and 4 months. He was followed as Pope 197 by Pope Benedict XII, and we will do him in a separate video. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.